August 2nd, 216 BC. Dawn breaks over the dusty plains of southeastern Italy near the small town of Cannae on the Aufidus River. On this single summer day, one of the largest armies Rome had ever assembled, almost 86,000 men, is about to march into a trap so perfectly conceived that it will become the gold standard of annihilation for the next 2,000 years. By sunset, more than 50,000 Romans will lie dead in the space of roughly 6 hours. One of the highest single-day death tolls in all of human history until the Industrial Age. The architect of this catastrophe is a 31-year-old Carthaginian genius named Hannibal Barca. What he achieves at Cannae is not merely a victory. It is the most devastating double envelopment in military history. A tactical masterpiece that will be studied by every great captain from Scipio Africanus to Norman Schwarzkopf. To understand how Rome suffered its darkest day, we must first go back 2 years, to the spring of 218 BC. Rome and Carthage are locked in the Second Punic War. Hannibal, having inherited the hatred of the Barca family for Rome, does the unthinkable. Instead of fighting at sea or in Spain, he marches an army of 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants straight over the snow-choked Alps. Half his men and almost all the elephants die in the crossing, but in the autumn of 218 BC, he descends into northern Italy like a thunderbolt. At the Trebia River in December 218, Hannibal lures a Roman army into a freezing ambush and destroys it. The following spring at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, he springs another trap in thick morning fog and annihilates another Roman force, 15,000 dead in 3 hours. Rome is stunned. 2 consuls dead or captured in less than a year. Panic grips the city. The Senate turns to an old-school solution. They will raise the largest army Rome has ever fielded and crush Hannibal by sheer weight of numbers. The consuls for 216 BC are Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, 2 men who bitterly dislike each other. Ancient sources blame the butcher Varro for what happens next, but modern historians see a more complex picture. Regardless, Rome gathers 8 full legions, double the normal consular army, plus an equal number of allied troops. Roughly 86,000 men, perhaps 70,000 heavy infantry, and 9,000 cavalry. It is the biggest army Rome will field until the days of the empire. Hannibal, by contrast, has maybe 50,000 men left after 2 years of constant campaigning, 40,000 infantry and 10,000 superb cavalry. Half of them Numidians, half heavy Gallic and Spanish horse under his younger brother Mago and the brilliant officer Hannibal. On paper, Rome should win. On the ground at Cannae, numbers will mean nothing. The battlefield is a flat, open plain about 5 miles wide between the Aufidus River on the Carthaginian left and low hills on the right. The river protects Hannibal's left flank. The hills limit maneuver on the right. A light southwest wind blows dust into the Romans' faces. Hannibal has chosen the ground carefully. The morning of August 2nd, the Romans deploy in an unusually deep, narrow formation. Instead of the normal 3 lines spread wide, Varro, who commands on this day according to Livy, masses his legions in a dense column, maniples packed shoulder to shoulder, perhaps 30 to 40 ranks deep. The intention is clear. Smash straight through the weaker-looking Carthaginian center and end the war in one hammer blow. Hannibal sees the trap being walked into. He does something that looks suicidal. He places his weakest troops, Gaulish and Spanish infantry, in the center, but deliberately thins and bows them forward into a crescent, almost inviting the Roman push. On his wings, he stations his elite African infantry, veterans armed with captured Roman equipment, in deep columns. His cavalry is split, the heavier Spanish and Gallic horse on his right by the river facing the weaker Roman cavalry. The lighter, faster Numidians on his left facing the allied Italian horse. The battle begins with a thunder of hooves. On the Carthaginian right, Hasdrubal, not the brother who will later invade Italy, leads 6,500 heavy cavalry in a ferocious charge. The Roman cavalry, outnumbered and outclassed, collapses almost immediately. Within minutes they are driven from the field, many fleeing across the river. Hasdrubal does not pursue far. Instead, he wheels his intact cavalry behind the Roman army toward the opposite flank. Meanwhile, on the left, the Numidians engage in their classic feigned retreat tactics, keeping the Italian cavalry occupied and away from the main fight. The stage is set. In the center, the Roman juggernaut slams into Hannibal's deliberately weak crescent. The Gauls and Spaniards fight bravely but begin to give ground, exactly as planned. Hannibal and Mago are in the front line with them, steadying the retreat. Step by step, the Carthaginian center falls back, drawing the entire Roman mass deeper into the pocket. The Roman formation, already deep and narrow, becomes even more compressed as the flanks are squeezed by the advancing African columns on both sides. What the Romans do not yet realize is that they are walking into a canyon of death. The Africans, who have been standing motionless all morning, now pivot inward like two great doors closing. At the same moment, Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry, having scattered the Roman horse, smashes into the rear of the allied cavalry on the Roman left and scatters them too. The Numidians now turn and join the pursuit. The entire Roman army is surrounded. What follows is not a battle. It is an execution. Trapped in a living wall of Carthaginian steel, the Roman legions have no room to maneuver, no room even to swing their swords properly. The press of bodies becomes so great that many Romans cannot raise their arms. Carthaginian soldiers step forward in relays, stabbing and cutting for hour after hour. The Greek historian Polybius, our best source, writes that men died standing up, unable to fall. Blood reportedly ran ankle deep. By late afternoon, the killing is methodical. Hannibal's troops work in shifts, fresh men replacing exhausted ones. The consul Aemilius Paulus, wounded early, refuses to flee and dies fighting on horseback. Some 10,000 Romans in the vanguard manage to cut their way out through the thinning Carthaginian center, but the rest, perhaps 65,000, are encircled. When the sun finally sets, the scale of the disaster becomes clear. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans and allies lie dead. Modern estimates usually settle around 55,000, 60,000 killed in roughly 6 hours of combat. Another 18,000 are captured, including many nobles. Roman cavalry losses are almost total. Hannibal loses perhaps 6,000, 8,000 men, mostly Gauls, in the center. It is the most lopsided slaughter in ancient history. Yet incredibly, Rome does not collapse. The city will refuse Hannibal's peace offers, raise new armies, and eventually turn the war around under the young Scipio, who studies Cannae obsessively and learns how to beat its lessons. But on this August evening in 216 BC, as carrion birds darken the sky above the Aufidus, the Roman world believes its doom has come. Cannae is more than a battle. It is the ultimate demonstration that brilliance can defeat numbers, that perfect timing and terrain can render the largest army helpless. For 2 millennia, generals have dreamed of repeating Hannibal's double-envelopment. Few have come close. None have surpassed it. Let us walk the killing ground itself, because the true horror of Cannae only reveals itself when we understand the physical reality of what happened inside that shrinking circle of death. The encircled Roman mass at the height of the battle occupied roughly 1 square kilometer, perhaps a little more. Into this space were crammed somewhere between 60,000 and 70,000 men, pressed so tightly together that Polybius records many could not even draw their swords from their scabbards. The Carthaginian ring around them was probably no more than 800 to 1,000 meters across. That means the average density inside the pocket approached 70 men per square meter, worse than the most overcrowded modern rock concert. Imagine the heat. August in Apulia is brutal. Temperatures that afternoon almost certainly exceeded 35 degrees C, 95 degrees. Tens of thousands of men in bronze and iron armor, packed body to body, screaming, bleeding, vomiting from terror and exhaustion. The dust kicked up by 100,000 feet turned to choking red mud as it mixed with blood and urine. Men in the center died of suffocation before a single blade touched them. Roman soldiers were trained to fight in ordered ranks with 2 meters of personal space. At Cannae, they had none. Their beloved gladius, the perfect weapon for disciplined stabbing in formation, became useless when you could not lift your elbow. Many threw away their shields simply to breathe. Others, according to ancient accounts, went mad, hacking at the press of their own comrades in blind panic. The Carthaginians killed with chilling efficiency. The African veterans on the wings used long thrusting spears and captured Roman swords in disciplined ranks, stepping forward, stabbing downward into the mass, then stepping back to let the next rank advance while they wiped their blades. The Spanish and Gallic troops opposite the Roman rear used slashing swords and javelins, cutting at necks and faces above the rim of shields. Hasdrubal's heavy cavalry dismounted and joined the slaughter on foot, driving lances into the backs of men who could not turn around. We have one extraordinary piece of archaeological testimony. In the 19th and 20th centuries, farmers near the modern town of Canossa di Puglia, ancient Cannae, regularly plowed up mass graves containing thousands of skeletons, almost all young adult males, many still wearing fragments of Roman military belts and armor. The bones show multiple sword cuts, spear thrusts through pelvis and spine, and, most telling, crushed skulls from the press of bodies. One grave excavated in the 1920s held over 2,000 skeletons in a pit only 20 meters long. The soil was still reddish from the iron in ancient. The psychological impact on Rome was apocalyptic. When the first survivors staggered into neighboring towns, they brought stories that sounded like the end of the world. Livy records that the Senate forbade women to mourn in the streets because the collective wailing threatened public order. Every senatorial family lost sons, brothers, or fathers. Of the 80 or so senators who marched out with the army, only 29 returned. Yet this is the paradox of Cannae. Rome's greatest military disaster became the forge of its ultimate victory. The Republic did not sue for peace. Instead, it declared a levée en masse. Every male citizen from 17 to 46 was conscripted. Slaves were offered freedom for enlistment. Even criminals were released to fill the ranks. The state mortgaged public land, melted temple treasures for coin, and lowered the property qualification for military service to almost nothing. Rome transformed itself into a total war society. Hannibal, for his part, made the one decision historians still argue about. He did not march on Rome itself. Maharbal's famous words, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but not how to use it," have echoed down the centuries. Whether because he lacked siege equipment, believed Rome would now negotiate, or simply misjudged Roman resolve, Hannibal turned south toward the wealthy cities of Campania, hoping to peel away Rome's Italian allies. He would wait 16 more years for another field battle on Italian soil. Rome refused to give him one. Instead, a new generation of Roman commanders, Fabius Maximus the Delayer, Marcellus the Sword, and finally the brilliant young Scipio, adopted a strategy of attrition, shadow, and eventual counter-invasion. They studied Cannae the way a traumatized child studies the monster that almost killed him, until they understood it better than Hannibal himself. Scipio Africanus was only 18 when news of Cannae reached Rome. He was present at the Tiber Bridge when the defeated consul Varro, covered in dust and shame, was nevertheless thanked by the Senate for not despairing of the Republic. That moment burned itself into the young man's soul. Years later, when Scipio finally faced Hannibal at Zama in 202 BC, he deliberately inverted Cannae. He placed his weakest troops in the center and his strongest on the wings, forcing Hannibal's own veterans to chase a retreating middle while Roman and Numidian cavalry executed the envelopment from behind. Hannibal recognized the echo of his own masterpiece and knew he had lost. But Cannae's shadow stretches far beyond the ancient world. In 1792, a young French artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte studied Cannae obsessively at the military school in Brienne. He later wrote in his notebooks that Hannibal's battle was the most perfect example of the art of war. At Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon allowed the Allied center to advance into a shallow pocket on the Pratzen Heights, then slammed the doors, shut with massed cavalry and artillery. The same geometry, updated for gunpowder. In August 1914, the German General Staff attempted a continental Cannae on the Western Front. The Schlieffen Plan was explicitly modeled on Hannibal's double-envelopment, a massive right hook through Belgium to encircle the French armies from behind. It failed by less than 50 kilometers at the Marne, but the ghost of Cannae hovered over every map room in Europe. Heinz Guderian and Erich von Manstein read the same texts in the 1930s. When they designed the Blitzkrieg campaign of May 1940, they spoke openly of achieving a Cannae with motors. At Sedan and Dunkirk, the panzer divisions performed the same maneuver at 70 kilometers an hour that Hannibal had executed at walking pace. Weak center retreating, strong armored wings closing the trap, enemy armies encircled and destroyed in days instead of hours. Even in the nuclear age, American officers at Fort Leavenworth and Soviet marshals at the Voroshilov Academy continued to teach Cannae as the ideal of annihilation battle. Norman Schwarzkopf's left hook in the Gulf War of 1991 was consciously designed as a modern Cannae on the desert floor. Only this time, the weaker center held just long enough for satellite-guided armor to close the pocket from 200 kilometers away. Yet for all its imitators, no one has ever matched the terrible perfection of the original. At Cannae, Hannibal fought with 50,000 men against 86,000 and inflicted a 10-to-1 loss ratio in 6 hours of daylight, without modern communications, without aerial reconnaissance, without any technological edge whatsoever. Only superior intelligence, perfect timing, and absolute mastery of terrain and psychology. Rome itself never forgot. The phrase a Cannae entered Latin as shorthand for total catastrophe. When Varus lost 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest in AD 9, Augustus reportedly wandered the palace crying, "Quintili vare legiones rede," "Give me back my legions," echoing the despair that had gripped the city 2 centuries earlier. And when Allied armies encircled the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad in November 1942, Soviet propagandists openly called it the Cannae of the Volga. Today, the battlefield itself is quiet. Wheat and sunflowers grow where the blood once flowed ankle-deep. A small archaeological park and a modest museum mark the spot. On windy days, the grass still seems to whisper with the ghosts of 50,000 men who, in the space of one summer afternoon, discovered that courage and numbers are sometimes not enough. Hannibal Barca would live another 33 years after Cannae, hounded across the Mediterranean, betrayed by allies, finally cornered in Bithynia, where he took poison rather than fall into Roman hands. His last words, according to legend, were bitter. "Let us relieve the Romans of their anxiety." Rome, the city that refused to die on August 2, 216 BC, would go on to rule the Mediterranean for 6 more centuries. And every general who ever dreamed of decisive battle has carried Cannae in his soul. The beautiful, terrible proof that a single day, a single plane, and one extraordinary mind can change the course of history forever. This is the final truth of Cannae. It was never just a battle. It was the moment when the ancient world learned that war could be an art form as exacting and merciless as sculpture, and that a single human intellect, perfectly attuned to terrain, timing, and terror, could annihilate the mightiest army ever assembled before the age of gunpowder. 50,000 men, perhaps as many as 60,000, died in 6 hours beneath an Italian sun. Fathers, sons, senators, farmers, boys who had never seen Rome itself. Their bodies were left for the crows because there were too many to bury and too few Carthaginians to do the work. For weeks the Aufidus ran red and wolves grew fat on the plains of Apulia. Yet from that mountain of corpses rose the Rome that would conquer the Mediterranean. The republic that staggered away from Cannae bleeding and half-blind refused every offer of peace, mortgaged its future, armed its slaves, and taught itself a new kind of war. One of patience, exhaustion, and eventual revenge. 17 years later, on another dusty plain at Zama, the student finally surpassed the master, and Hannibal's dream died with him. Cannae stands alone, the purest, most terrible, most imitated victory in military history. Every would-be Alexander, every staff college prodigy, every dictator with a map and a dream has measured himself against that August afternoon in 216 BC. Almost all have fallen short. The wheat still grows. The wind still blows from the southwest, carrying the faint dust of an ancient battlefield. And somewhere beneath the soil lie the bones of 50,000 Romans who, in the final hours of their lives, discovered the precise difference between courage and genius. That difference was Hannibal Barca, and that difference changed the world.